Welcome back to this special edition of Indianomics, where we are in conversation with three experts: Rajendra Chitle, Managing Partner of Chitle & Company; Amandeep Chopra, Group President, Head of Fixed Income, UTI; and Anant Narayan, Head Financial Markets, formerly at Standard Chartered Bank, and a market expert on bonds. Well, you know, we are going to assume that the bonds are backed by the government because we don't have time to discuss whether they are not backed by government. I'm taking that as axiomatic. But I just want to know what you would like as the tenor of the bond. Should they be perpetual, Rajendra?
I don't think so. They should be long enough. At the end of the day, the objective is what? The objective is that the government will take equity, which over time will appreciate. It will eventually give returns to the government of India in excess of the bond yield.
So they're like 25 years?
I would think it should be between 20 and 30 years. And it should not be certainly 10. Okay. But it should not be perpetual.
Okay. Anant, would you think that they should be, permanently a non-SLR, or they become SLR at some point in time?
Again, given the original intent is not to infuse cash into the system, I think it should be permanently non-SLR. But on the point of maturity, I have a slightly different view. A, they should not be perpetual, which I agree with, because if you're doing a perpetual asset side to back a perpetual liability side infusion, it's just an accounting entry. I mean, it becomes effectively plus minus perpetual, right? The second part is, so therefore it should not be perpetual, it should be staggered, because you don't want 1,35,000 crores of bonds maturing at the same time. It should be staggered. Yeah. But I don't think it should be up to 20-25 years. After all, the government, I think, does have a plan eventually to divest and bring down the stake in the banks. And so you have to assume that the equity infusion you're doing eventually will be monetizable by the government as well. So you've got to treat this as two genuinely independent transactions. One, you're borrowing money from the market. Two, you're infusing equity and taking capital risk, equity risk on banks. That risk transformation is what gives so much of strength to the markets. The government is genuinely taking on equity risk by borrowing debt, right? And you don't want to lose the sense of that color. And so therefore, I think you have to treat those bonds independently, make it 7, 10, 12, 15-year maturity like any other normal bonds. Don't go 20, 25 years. This is nothing special. By 7, 10, 15 years, you should be able to divest the equity stake as well.
Okay, but that is why the SPV becomes necessary, because at several points in time, the SPV may be holding more bonds and less equity if the equity divestment happens.
That's right.
But, a very quick question to you, Amandeep. You said that banks may want HTM for that bonds. Then how will they be tradable?
No, precisely. I think if they are to avoid the mark-to-market component of these bonds, given the fact that they exist anyway, have a fairly large portion of their portfolio which is mark-to-market, given the decline in the HTM component as per the latest RBI policy, I think they will only be too happy to ensure that this doesn't add to the overall mark-to-market component.
Okay.
Secondly, I think on the question of tenor, I think I just put in my point across. Clearly, I would like to see the bonds not beyond 10 odd years of maturity. However, the government can actually build in a callable feature. So I think as and when they're able to monetize, the equity with maybe some degree of appreciation, they should be able to redeem or call back these bonds. And that, I think, will allow them a fairly good degree of flexibility in ensuring, a smooth passage of maturity.
That's another element that's introduced. I don't know if we can do justice to that idea now, because I want to come to the equity part. Rajendra, should it be rights? Should it be preferentially issued? And if we can squeeze in, should they be partly in AT1 bonds, additional tier 1 bonds?
Okay. I think in terms of rights versus preferential, it's really a call of whether if the rights issue remains undersubscribed, perceptionally it will be negative, and therefore whether preferential route is a straight and square route. I'm issuing a bond and I'm willing to put that money back into equity. It's a very straight way of doing it. So maybe from an optic and perspective, otherwise each bank will do a rights issue which potentially will get undersubscribed. So in a sense, rather than saying, hey, equity holders, please own up the problem, the government here comes and says that I'm issuing a bond, I'm owning it up, and I'm backstopping it.
Okay. Anant, additional tier 1, should some of them be AT1 bonds so that this equity issue of SEBI having to give a forbearance may not rise?
No, Latha, I think there are 4 options of infusing money through on the liability side for banks. One, as you said, preferential allotment of shares to the government. 2, rights issue. Third is a preferential allotment to the government alongside a QIP. And fourth is 81.
Okay.
Now, between a preferential share and a rights issue, I think operationally a preferential allotment of shares would be a lot more easier than rights issue. Rights issue has a lot of plethora of, like a public issue, it has a lot of things to be worried about. I genuinely think for the good banks, for the strong banks, a combination of a preferential allotment of shares and a QIP will really fly. That's one way of actually bringing in your non-government money as well. The 58,000 crores which has to come in can come in through the QIP route, because the pricing is fairly transparent and protective of minority shareholders. I don't think minority shareholders will have a problem as well, because you have a formula based on current market prices for infusing money through both preferential allotment as well as through a QIP. I think that could be a lot smarter. But for the weaker banks, both a rights issue and a QIP might not really fly. You might, as Mr. Chitare was saying, you might not get enough bids, in which case you have to think about a straight preferential issue or just an 81. Or you don't bring in money into the weaker banks, you bring in extra money into the larger banks and then try and tie it up with consolidation as well. So there are various, permutations and combinations possible here.
That is an issue for another show altogether, whether it should be tied to performance and to what extent, and consolidation. That's a whole big chapter. If we are even, finding it difficult to do a rights issue because it would be time consuming and probably even a little messy, to tie in consolidation into this is going to be extremely difficult, and certainly not within outside the time limits of this show. We have to call it a day on this edition of Indianomics. Anant, Amandeep and Rajendra, thank you very much for joining me. The key takeaways from this, preferably it should be via an SPV. It's likely to be an SPV being set up for the purpose, and it will have to be a non-SLR issue of bonds, probably non-marketable to some extent, so that HTM problems don't arise for the banks, and the interest rate probably either at 364-day or probably a small spread over 364-day, and even then some forbearance will be called on the part of SEBI, because in some cases the government stake is going to be above 75% and even in some cases above 90%. Those are the key takeaways from our batch of guests. We will have more discussions on whether to bring consolidation into this discussion. Thank you very much for watching this edition.